Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord. We're a group of like-minded people using John Vervaeke's work to cultivate wisdom, meaning, and communitas. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe because it really helps us with the algorithm. And if you're new to us, you'll find a link to the Discord in the notes. And if you want to ask your own questions for this monthly Q&A, you'll have to join the Discord server to do so. My name is Brett, and now I'm pleased to welcome John Vervaeke here again to answer your questions. Hi, John. How are you?
Hi, Brett. I'm good, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much. We always appreciate you here. And Andre, our admin, is here with us. How are you, Andre?
Yeah, not bad. Just quite a bit cold here. It's getting into winter, but not as bad as the Canadian winter. So I can't really complain.
As we're being hit with a heat wave and entering our summer, yeah, we're on the other side of the world. As we're truly a global server here. So Andre and I will be alternating asking questions. I'll start off by reading a question from Victor Pless, who asked, "Hi, Dr. Vervaeke. My question is, why is music so special among all the arts? That is, how can listening and playing music provide such a deep and engaging experience like nothing else? Second question, how can an amateur musician, meaning crisis ridden, get the most out of this experience? Thank you."
The answer to the first question is it requires some development because I think it's a really good question. Um, so, a part of the experience of sacredness is when we find the actual process of religio what we're focusing on rather than um, a particular problem at hand or a particular object we're trying to observe, etc. So, what happens when we are finding an experience sacred is when we are doing the religio for its own sake. And this goes back to sort of a notion of meaning and sacredness uh, that I've got from Michael Polanyi. So, in music, because there is no referent, because we're not doing it and referring to anything else, we are actually becoming focally aware of the process of meaning making, of religio, of relevance realization for its own sake. And we're doing salience landscaping for its own sake. We are following patterns and rhythms and harmonies for their own sake. And as John Rusin makes very clear, that is a feature of all of our intelligibility, what I've called on his behalf the musicality of intelligibility. Well, in music, we directly, seriously play with the musicality of intelligibility for its own sake. So we are activating it, accentuating it, celebrating it, sharing it, reinforcing its importance in our lives. And we do that because we find the meaning making process, because I would argue, because it's so central to our cognitive agency and our place in the world, all those arguments that I've made. We find the celebration of musicality of intelligibility inherently interesting and pleasurable. One of the things that relevance realization has to take an inherent and rewarding interest in is itself, because it is an inherently self correcting and therefore self involving process. And this is how it's an extension of life, because life is a self creating, self involving, self celebrating process. So music plugs us directly into the guts of relevance realization, intelligibility, sense making, salience landscaping, and the way all of these things are convergent and overlapping with each other. And so I think that's why music is the purest of the arts. You see other art medium like visual art often moving towards less representational aspects, expressionist and abstract art, in order to try and, this is directly what's going on in Kandinsky's work, right? He talks about the spirit within art, the spirituality within art. You're moving towards picking up on the process itself, helping people to come aware of the very process of the musicality of intelligibility and value it for its own sake. So I think that's why music is the one of the maybe the most primary. Poetry comes close because we're using language often to try and recapture the poesis, the meaning making that's found in language, rather than the meaning found in language. Um, and so, and of course, we often think that poetry and music should therefore go together, and that's what song is, and that poetry and music, song should go together with moving the body, which is another way in which we try to get into this more pure uh, salience landscaping for its own sake, musicality of intelligibility. So we have, song and dance go together. So we have poetry and music and gesture going together. And I think that points to something very primordial about us. And that's why we like to engage in it. And it's why we find things that bring those together. Song and dance often are where we most powerfully experience the sacred. Many people, if you interview people that still go to church, for example, and I'm not making any criticism here on Christian metaphysics, but many people will say they go to church because they like the singing and the music and the ritual, the singing and the dancing, if I could put it that way. And so I think that's why it's important. Somebody who's an amateur musician, um, really immersed in the meaning crisis, might want to take a look at some people who are trying to invent new genres of song and dance. I've often mentioned Akira the Don's Meaning Wave, in which he's trying to reconfigure the nature of song, and he's often there actually moving, dancing to it on the video. So it's very interesting to become aware of these emerging genres and perhaps find ways to practice in them and to celebrate them, and so that they become much more shareable with many more people. So that would be my answer to that question.
I think it's a fascinating answer there, John, because I think what you just described was the origination of hip hop, because the four elements in there all map up to what
Oh,
you were saying.
yeah.
Because you
Yeah.
have the movement of the body with the break dancing. You
Yep.
have storytelling through rapping.
Yes.
The
Yep.
DJ who selects music and so on, and that I think that works together to make some sort of embodied intelligibility through a cultural cognitive grammar, which then goes into write a narrative that is shared and spread um, to help a culture find meaning and others find meaning through that process.
Andre, that's completely apropos. My younger son, um, he was in his teen years. He still is, but he's coming out the other end. And like many teenagers, he was drifting, and that was exacerbated by social media and other stuff. And then he discovered Mac Miller, and in combination with other things, therapy and so forth, that completely turned him around. And now he is, I mean, and I think he would not object to me saying he finds Mac Miller's work sacred, in a profound way. He wants to have it tattooed on him and other things, and so he really identifies with that. And now he's writing poetry based on this for his English courses. He's into sound and music production. He's really found his way and his voice, and so I totally agree with what you're proposing because I've seen it in the case of my younger son.
Oh wow, yeah, it's transformative. Um,
Yes.
so the next question is by Dayon in brackets Nicola. It says, "Please ask John what he thinks of my way of thinking about the virtues. As I studied applied math, I imagine this virtue space, and in all the dialectic interdialogos I have participated in or watched everything. It always starts with a personal take on virtue at hand. Most of the time, as one strategy that comes to it, I recognize in most self-improving practices I can think of. Of this, I think as understanding one's current position in this space, and of virtues, I think of directions in this space. And the more we stay in dialogos with one virtue, the more it grows to others, and to a oneness of a kind, and And the more I start seeing the overlapping between the different virtues, I imagine they all intersect in an infinite point, which for me is the divine, God, or whatever one calls the ultimate ideal, which is always beyond.
I love it. That's my response, but I'll say something a little bit more, a little bit more explication. The idea of the virtues as a through line, a trajectory, in a space of ongoing self transcendence, and that the virtues intersect in something like the logos and in wisdom, um, and that would ultimately be something divine, is a very Platonic idea. And I think it's also very relevant for a lot of the work I'm doing on dialectic and dialogos, eidetic adduction. It's very consonant with Peirce's knowing, Charles Sanders Peirce, of, that the truth is actually the convergence that would be achieved if we have a community of seekers given infinite amount of time, um, sort of maximal plausibility, something like that. I think that binds the notion of the virtues as a vector through normativity space, through self-transcendence space, to the ongoing advance of intelligibility and its capacity for disclosing the depths of reality. So I love it. I think it's an excellent proposal. I'm very much interested in this idea of a trajectory of transframing that traces out the through line, and that also affords human beings self-transcendence, the true, the good, and the beautiful in some fashion. So, yeah, I love it. I think it's great.
Right. Aiden writes, I would propose that in general, as procedural knowledge is transformed into propositional knowledge in the form of the standard operating procedures, that it has an effect of reducing and or removing the participatory aspect of procedural knowledge, such that one's ability to problem solve an issue with equipment, for example, can be hindered by reciprocally limiting effects of propositional approaches, as they are limiting an operator's participatory nature in how they interact and don't interact with the process. The participatory seems a hinge point in our ability to create feedback systems that afford recursive relevance realization. Is it fair to argue that a lack of participatory knowledge is at the center of the meaning crisis over all forms of cognition?
Wow. First of all, let me agree with a lot of the argument. For those of you who have seen the talk I gave at Cambridge, the invited lecture, I propose that procedural is the space in which we transform the propositional. And of course, that's a standard notion, even going back to Chomsky, of rules and transformations. Transformations are not themselves representations. So the procedural transformations are the space in which we transform oppositional relations. The perspectival, of course, is a space in which we, by moving to different perspectives, different states of mind and situational awareness, we can transform the procedurals or the skills we're activating, coordinating, or acquiring. And then the participatory level is very much the level in which we can move between different perspectives. And since meta-perspectival ability is central to wisdom, participatory level is central to wisdom. And if you understand wisdom as the ongoing flexible capacity for evolving our relevance realization in a recursively self-correcting manner, and by removing the participatory, often truncating perspectival, because when we make things propositional like that, we tend to make the procedurals completely automatic, and by the definition, automatic processing is happening without consciousness, without perspectival knowing. I think in many ways, what is being described here is the and this is a Heideggerian idea, the technological instantiation of what I have called propositional tyranny. But propositional tyranny isn't just about propositions. It's a way in which the questioner has indicated propositional gets inframed, Einstellung, or what is it? Is it? It's not. Is it Einstellung? I can't remember what what the German word is for framing. I think I'm getting the wrong word, but it's in framing. It becomes a fundamental in framing for us, that not only in terms of the level of our belief, but how the environment is structured to operate around us. We get cut off from the depths of the procedural, and so it gets reduced to just power, and we get more deeply cut off from the perspectival, and so we become like zombies, and then we are completely cut off from the participatory, in which we, of course, are, in the midst of the meaning crisis. So, in that way, I agree with the claim that one central way in which the meaning crisis has arisen and is developing is through the constant translation attempt to replace, not even translate. Let's be stronger here. Let's be more Heideggerian. Attempt to replace the procedural, perspectival, and the participatory with the algorithmic. And that is the Cartesian wet dream. That is the Cartesian fantasy about how we will be able to realize this. Of course, that model, I think, is just bedeviled by all of the ways, the Gödel within mathematics and combinatorial explosion within artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Heisenberg within physics, the measurement problem within physics. This attempt to get a completely algorithmic formal system automatically running, and that's one definition, by the way, of a computer, an automatic formal system. Try and somehow make that how we fundamentally operate, has been basically undermined in many different disciplines, in many different dimensions of our ontology, and I would argue, I think very plausibly, in a highly convergent manner. And so this process, I think, is collapsing. And one of the things I would like to do is try to renew a different sense of what we mean, what Plato meant by form, remove it from that algorithmic formulation. Formulation is not itself algorithmic, but a proposal about the algorithmic, and come up with a different understanding. And that's why I go back to the original Greek word eidos. Try and get back a different understanding of intelligibility that does not try to do that, but instead vouchsafes and actually prioritizes non-algorithmic aspects of our cognition.
So this next question is a short question, and it's from Mark 12, and it's: is the relation prior to the relata?
I think the answer I would give is that many people, myself included, are trying to overcome that dichotomy and understand the relations and the relata as completely interdefining, interdependent aspects of existence. You can't have the relation without the relata, but the relata can't also exist without the relations. Relations and the relata are equally real. You might want to say bottom-up emergence emphasizes the relata and then tries to bring in the relations. Emanation tends to emphasize the relations, the whole, the form, the eidos, and then tries to explain or attempts to explain how the particularization into specific entities emerges. I shouldn't have said emerges, emanates. And for me, asking the question, when you put it into the ontological framework, what you see, what is disclosed is that this is based on work done way back in the 80s, in the before times, by Gerald Katz in the Metaphysics of Meaning, that both ways have deep problems. Emergence can't explain the ordering of the wholes. and why the wholes have properties beyond the parts, why they have the relations they do, why intelligibility is ordered in that way. Why do wholes fit into wholes, fit into wholes? I'm using wholes, W-H-O-L-E, into wholes, into gestalts, into gestalts, into gestalts. And why does that, like, why does that happen in the ordered way it was? This is a deep problem acknowledged by people from Plato to Whitehead. Possibility has to be organized, or the way actuality unfolds intelligibly doesn't make any sense. So emergence has, where are the wholes? How do they exist such that they can act as a normative influence? How are they ordered with respect to each other? That's the problem facing emergence. The emanation problem is, well, if I start from absolute oneness, how do I get difference into where does all the real difference come from? Right? And if you have a multiplicity in your as your source of emanation, then of course you'll fall prey to all the typical arguments for emanation, which is there has to be some unifying principle behind them, etc., etc., etc. This argument gets repeated over and over again, so that the ultimate source of emanation is a one. And before you snicker about the silly people of antiquity, take a look at physics proposing the absolute singularity of the Big Bang, from which everything somehow comes, and to which everything is still somehow bound through things like entanglement. It's right there. It's the same thing. It's the same problem. Where does all the difference come from? And so for me, recognizing that both ways, emergence up from the things, emanation down from the gestalt, are equally and symmetrically right, problematic, leads me to the conclusion that neither one of them should be privileged in our ontological articulation.
John, sorry, can I just ask you to define relation and relata for the audience?
Oh, a relata are the things that are in relation. So the table is wet, right? So there's a relation between table and water, presumably, and the water and the table are the relata, and the wetness is a relationship between them, or you can even think it as a causal relation, right? The bat hit the ball. The hitting is the relationship between the bat and the ball. The bat and the ball are the relata. So you can have ontologies that privilege the individuals. That, by the way, is the original meaning of substance. Substance doesn't mean stuff in Aristotle. It means the individual. So a classic example of a substance for Aristotle is Socrates, because Socrates is that to which predicates can be attached, but which is not itself a predicate. So you can build an ontology up from substantial individuals, and then the relations are merged between them, or they might not even be real, like nominalism claims. Or you can build an ontology in which relatedness, oneness, integration is primary, and then you try and unpack individuals from it. These are completely symmetrical and are equally problematic proposals. They both have a lot going for them. They both need each other in some self-corrective fashion. I take the conclusion from that being we should not try to prioritize either the relations as we get in structural realism, which is one branch of the philosophy of science, or in the things, the relata, which is mechanism realism, which is another branch in the philosophy of science. And you can have quantum people trying to talk about the relata and then degenerating into relations, collapsing of probability waves for change. And you can have the people who want to talk about relations. That's what relativity is. Relativity is an inherently relational entity, ontological entity, not a thing, but it's an inherently relational. And then they can get bunged up with, yes, but how can we understand gravity, right, as a purely relational thing? You can see it. You can see it everywhere. I just gave you another example. This attempt try and decide between emergence and emanation, I think is the meta problem. When we stop trying to decide between them, move to what many mystical traditions within many different ontological frameworks have concluded, they're both somehow equally real, and we should stop asking, is it the relata before the relation, or the relation before the relata?
Thank you. Clark asks, have people always considered that the Bible stories or religious stories were symbolic and not literal happenings? Or have people always thought that they really happened as historical events?
Rick, sorry to interrupt. The signal dropped for a sec. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Have people always considered that the Bible stories or religious stories were symbolic and not literal happenings? Or have people always thought that they really happened as historical events? Or were there different groups of interpretation, some more exoteric and others more esoteric?
So it's a really hard question to answer because early Christianity. So we had, and I mean this in the proper sense of the word, we had a mythos in Protestantism that we had gotten away from original Christianity, and if we could go back in time, we would converge on an original Christianity that all Christians could agree on. And this was, of course, Luther's proposal. He thought the convergence would go so far back that the Jews would see it and go, yes, of course. Of course, that did not happen, and it's not happening even more so today. As archaeology, historiography, history, biblical criticism open up, we realize that as we move back into the past, we do not get a unified Christianity. We get a widely diverse Christianity, many different groups, and the boundaries between Christianity and Hermeticism and various forms of Gnosticism, like Sethians and the Valentians, and then the Ebionites, who believed that Jesus was a Messiah but not the Son of God, and the Marcionites and Arianism, and it's all over the place, and it's a mess. So the hope that there is an originary thing that we can get back to and say, is this the way it's always been? I think we have to really seriously question that. This is one of my deeper problems. I haven't discussed it as much because I didn't feel I could bring it up often in a context that was appropriate to the dialogue at hand. But this is one of my problems with sort of a central part of Protestant grammar, the idea that we are protesting the Catholic Church because we have got away from original Christianity. I don't mean to be insulting or offensive, but I don't believe that there was an original Christianity. I mean, you can even see it in the book of Acts. There's a conflict between the followers of James, the brother of John, and they became the Ebionites, plausibly, and Paul, who believes in taking Christianity to the Gentiles. There's so much going on. Now, that means that you have a wide variation in how people take scriptures from the very beginning. People seeing them possibly as literally true. Many people, towards perhaps a more Gnostic or hermeneutic end of things, seeing them much more symbolically. Then you get the attempt to organize all of that with emerging orthodoxy. You already see it by the time of people like Augustine. You can see it, it's being pre-created by Philo within Judaism and within Neoplatonism as they reinterpret the Greek myths. The idea that there are these levels of interpretation. At the literal level, and that's the least important, and then there's a sort of a deeper level. I forget the orders. There's a moral level, and there's an allegorical level, there's a spiritual level, and you can see Jonathan Pageau exemplifying pulling people away from the literal and very much reenacting that medieval, and that's not an insult word for me at all, the medieval idea that there are multiple levels of interpretation, that the literal is basically The way it's understood is the literal is for children to help them get towards the deeper levels. And so here's an analogy for you. Open up a textbook, and you're presented with the atom as a solar system. And you're sort of, that's a picture that you can actually sort of literally take in your mind. But it's not really true. As Elgin says, it's true enough because it teaches you and trains you enough so you can move into a deeper understanding of the atom. That's very much the attitude, the medieval attitude had towards the scriptures. When Protestantism comes into the fore, you get this drive, profound nostalgia, which is part of the reason why I think Protestantism is vulnerable to fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is an absolutization of nostalgia. In Protestantism, you get this profound nostalgia for trying to get back to the original text, the original Christianity, right? The original experience of being born again. You get this drive towards the literal, and then that gets really accelerated with the advent of science, which calls into question literal interpretation, and you get a bifurcation. Liberal Christianity basically says we won't take the Bible literally because that doesn't run with science, and you get the fundamentalists saying no, we're going to double down on that. The literal interpretation is Bible is inerrant, it's literally true, and that is the only interpretation of the Bible, or that is the most important interpretation we should make of the Bible. So I'm sorry for the long historical answer, but the question requires that kind of answer. I think it's the overall answer is I think that there has always been a continuum of interpretation. I think the medieval people came the closest to trying to stabilize it into a systematic practice. I think that got smashed, especially by the Protestant Reformation. And we're now in the place where a question like this emerges. I would put it to you that like if you're trying to read the Bible transformatively, not informatively, that a literal reading should be treated like the solar system model of the atom. It's an initial platform that you take to be true until you learn why it's not true, and you can move into the deeper interpretations that afford deeper transformation. I mean, and if you say, "Oh no," well, I mean, I'm sorry, but Christianity is premised on an often symbolic, allegorical reinterpretation of the Old Testament, and it accepts the Neoplatonic argument that a lot of myth should be reinterpreted allegorically. So that's my answer to that really good question.
It's a fascinating answer, and it does remind me, like, even in things like communion between different denominations, you can see these differences.
Yes.
Transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and so on.
Yes.
There are some who believe in this that the wafer and the wine is symbolic of
Yes.
the blood of Jesus, and
Yes,
then
very
there are
much.
others who believe it's like the literal. So yeah,
It's
lots of minutiae and
yeah, and it's so odd. Protestantism, which is often so committed, at least certain. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Fundamentalist Protestantism that is so committed to a literal reading of the Bible is almost always aligned with a purely symbolic interpretation of the Eucharist. It's the way this history has unfolded in such a complex way.
yeah, I agree with that exactly. So now we have a question which is a bit lighter, which is, what's your opinion concerning abortion and medically assisted suicide? I believe that these two issues go to the very heart of the meaning crisis: freedom, the body, and transhumanism. And this is from Fanny.
What is my? I mean, what would my opinion be worth? I guess the reason why my opinion might be worth something is because of the claim that it goes to the heart of the meaning crisis. I think these issues go to the heart of the meaning crisis via the fact that the notion of what a person is unstable for us right now, and we do not know how to integrate the traditions of personhood and the fact that we are also a primate. This is Greg Enriquez's way of putting it. We are primates that are also persons. This is something Greg and I wrestled with, and Chris and Greg and I wrestled with in The Elusive I, that Greg and Harry Hovanesian and I have just been wrestling with in Psychopathology and Well-Being. So take it that why these issues come up is because we feel that there is a special relationship we have with persons that we do not have to non-persons, and that those relationships are properly moral relationships. Insofar as these questions bear on personhood, they are simultaneously moral issues. I agree, they point to some of the central problematic within the meaning crisis, which is, what the heck do we mean by a person is also a primate that has evolved according to naturalistic processes of evolution, but nevertheless can make claims about truth, goodness, and beauty that no chimp, or presumably even Homo erectus, was capable of doing, and who enter into community not just like wolves of social cooperation, but of culture, whereby we share systems of meaning by which we attempt to respond to what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. That, I think, is the key crucial question. I'm going to say something, and it's going to annoy everybody. Then I'll give a more specific answer. My overall answer is we are trying to resolve these issues, and I know why we have to resolve them. They're exigent and urgent, especially after what's going to happen in the United States. But we can't answer them. That's precisely why they are unfolding the way they do, which is vociferous, aggressive, often life-threatening, antagonistic debate. Because the questions are urgent, we cannot properly formulate them. In order to properly formulate the question, we have to answer the problem I just posed. How are primates persons? How are persons primates? How the heck we bring together the dialogues and the discourses that create and celebrate personhood with those that explain, remind us, and acknowledge that we are primates? How do we do that? How do we do that? For me, that requires a much bigger answer of how do we respond to meaning crisis. So my bold things to say, and then I'll be a lot more responsive, aptly responsible, is I do not think these debates are resolvable by us. I think we need to resolve them. I totally acknowledge that. I do not think they are resolvable by us because we cannot understand what personhood is. We are going through this weird process in which we are in the science finally grounding our personhood and our cognition and our body, and then attempts to sort of remove identity and personhood from embodiment, a kind of neo-Gnosticism. There's all kinds of things at work here. So I think that any opinion I offer, based on the conclusion I just gave you, is merely an opinion, and therefore largely useless. I won't dodge or cop out. That's my opinion. My opinion is, since we can't clearly resolve what personhood is, we need something like a sliding criterion, so that a fertilized egg is not a person, that even a full-grown baby is not a person. Just hang on before you jump on me, but it is precisely the entity that is completely deserving of agape, so that we can help it realize its personhood. human beings that are raised by wolves don't develop personhood. And if that doesn't mean that they don't have the moral status of personhood. This is exactly the problem I'm pointing to. The moral status of personhood, but they are basically just intelligent primates. We do not know how to bring those two together. I propose a sliding scale in which, right, most people, around, after the first trimester is where you should start thinking about seriously limiting abortion. And I know people who are pro-choice won't like to hear that, and people who are pro-life don't like to hear that. And we have to constantly take into account the context of where we are setting the criterion. Like when you look at signal detection theory, is the noise in a bush a leopard or the wind? You don't know absolutely. You have to take a gamble at where you set your criterion. You might miss the leopard, you might mistake the wind, and you have to decide which one of the errors is more risky, more important. And of course, we have two kinds of errors. We might be killing a person, but we're intruding on the autonomy of women. And so which error is worse? And that's going to slide according to the circumstance, according to the timing. I think it gets to be a very complex question, and we can't resolve it cleanly or easily because we do not have well-defined understanding of personhood. The idea of euthanasia is different. I think if we allow people to sacrifice their lives for others, there is no way we could deny them sacrificing their life for themselves. I can't find a morally consistent argument that says, look at how amazing he is. He died so that person wouldn't suffer anymore. What a hero. Let's applaud that. Oh, he wants to die to end his suffering? Oh, that's horrible. That's horrible. I can't find a morally consistent way of putting those together. So for me, we're now in a situation where there is a person, and I think that if we are morally consistent, we should allow people to make well-educated, well-informed, well-reflected decisions, which means we don't let people make this decision because they're in depression or because they're suffering from anorexia or because they've just lost a spouse and they're in deep grief, because we can point to evidence that there are ways out of those that do not require suicide. If we get into a position where we're condemning people to unending suffering and we can point to no evidence that there's an alternative way out, what morally consistent argument could we bring to say that shouldn't be done because we approve and we applaud and we praise death for the reduction of the suffering of others? Why that would not apply to me? I die to reduce my suffering. And I do it under a circumstance where there's no alternative. I mean, that's my position on euthanasia. Again, it is qualified by, I expect my position, my opinion will be overturned and we get a better answer to what personhood is, and that is part of a better overall answer and response to the meaning crisis. I suppose I've annoyed many, many people by these, and I want to remind you the status I gave to the second part. I'm very open to discussion about my opinions precisely because I gave you just my most plausible attempt to take a stab at an answer that for right now I would argue cannot be given a definitive answer. That's my response.
We appreciate the thought provocation. Pat, you have a question for John, and you were hoping your mic is working. Let's see. So you can just press unmute, and we should be able to hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hey, John. Love your work.
Thank you, Pat.
So I loved your last conversation with Sevilla King, where it was, I think it was actually like 5 months ago, but you talked about how Neoplatonism has been able to enter into reciprocal reconstruction with a variety of religions as well as with science.
Yes.
To paraphrase one thing you said you want to bring the classical Greek notion of scientia back together with our modern mathematical and experimental sciences.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you have any book recommendations that helps to unpack this complex relationship between Platonism and the philosophy of science. So,
Yes.
some context here will be helpful. Um, I like the idea that central to wisdom is finding the right relationship between appearance and reality.
Yes.
In
Yes.
this way, it strikes me that Platonism not only needs phenomenology to stay grounded, but it also
Yes.
needs science because of its insistence on empirical observation, and that's in the domain of appearances.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that's what I'm kind of looking for. I'm wondering if there is a philosophy of science book that does justice to the influence of Platonism while also providing that kind of useful critique.
Yes. I'm just going to get the book because I want to make sure that I get the title right. I think it's called John, one sec. Yes. So, a book I cannot recommend enough, that's had a significant influence on me, is Platonism and the Objects of Science by Scott Berman, Berman. Point about Pat, I would ask you to watch the Voices with Vervaeke that I had with John Rusin, or if you get a chance, some of the conversations I had with Johannes Niederhauser and Daniel Zaruba, because John Rusin and I and Daniel and Johannes and I are very much about trying to integrate phenomenology with Neoplatonism. And this is a lot of what I'm trying to do with eidetic eduction and dialectic into dialogos, and to integrate that with how Neoplatonism, I think, is properly integrated with science. And like I said, I recommend Platonism and the Objects of Science to do the philosophy of science. If you want a little bit about the history of this, John Spencer's The Eternal Law is a good book. There's a lot, but the philosophy of science is the Berman book. The history is the Spencer book, and then John Rusin and my work are also about trying to integrate phenomenology into and Platonism back together. And this is something I'm doing a lot with the work of Dan Chiappi. You can see other people doing this. D.C. Schindler is very much trying to integrate phenomenology and Platonism back together in his work. His book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, is an exemplary instance of that.
Okay, thank you. Those are great recommendations.
And they're great books. Schindler's book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, the best book I've read on Plato ever, I think, especially on Plato's Republic. The Berman book is excellent because it really brings the critique of nominalism front and center in a powerful way. The Spencer book is good just for giving you the history. And like I said, the Rusin book is somebody like me right now who's trying to integrate phenomenology and Platonism back together.
So, I've actually read the Platonism and the Objects of Science by Berman.
Yes.
That was a great read. And one thing that I had that I wish he had a dialogue with. Sorry, you're breaking up.
I just want to make sure that, I mean, he is doing something really gutsy in the philosophy of science, right? Since Quine, right, we have sort of foregrounded nominalism as sort of somehow an essential feature of science. And Berman is saying, no, nominalism is not a central feature of science. Platonism is actually what you need in order to do science. And I think this is a really central move.
And have you done any work on trying to integrate Berman's work with Alicia Ioraro's work, Dynamics in Action, to try to bring the transcendence down into the immanence?
Yes, and that's very much what the eidetic eduction is trying to do. When I talk about the through line through all the appearances, and remember that eidos originally meant the look or aspect of a thing. When I talk about the through line, I'm talking about something like, right, what you get, in a state space where you get the attractor, which is a self-organizing through line. Very much, and I'm trying to understand. This is so. I mean, the relevance realization machinery is sort of the attempt to get at the cognitive pole of how intelligibility emerges, and it's very much deeply influenced with Uraro. And then the emanation emergence ontology that I've been trying to articulate is the corresponding ontological structure that participates in the production of intelligibility, and how relevance realization and reality realization have a possible conformity. I think the ongoing promise at the depths of our cognitive access to intelligibility will always be met by a deeper disclosure of reality. That's for me what I think Plato ultimately meant by the good. That promise will never fail, and that we can therefore in some sense entrust ourselves to it. I can't give you an argument for it because every argument presupposes it. And so, yeah, I am trying very much to do exactly what you just proposed. It's hard. It's hard. But I do think with the help of other people that I'm making progress. I feel that right now, I don't know how much value this is, but maybe it's meant to encourage. I'm entering into one of the most creative periods of my whole sort of academic professional life around all of this stuff.
That's awesome.
So sorry, Pat. We're gonna have to. We don't have that much time left, so we're gonna have to move on.
Sure.
But thank you so much, John. We've got.
Thank you, John.
John, we have
Welcome,
we have 3 people queued left. Do you have a hard out at 7:30? How are you doing for time?
I can go about 7:40, but then I gotta go.
All right, so let's see if we can try to get these last 3 questions. Three. Yeah, three. Actually, there's 4, but we'll try to get to 3. So okay. Chris, you have a question for John.
Yeah, how's it going, John? Awesome. My question will riff a little bit off of Pat's, so hopefully Pat will get some reconciliation. So last time we talked, John, you mentioned that you were doing work on Nietzsche's critique of Plato. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on Nietzsche's critique, specifically regarding Platonism pulling away from the existential playing field to rather an empty, kind of vacant space of transcendence. And in doing so, this is kind of what Nietzsche thinks. He thinks that Plato's overlaying the type of thinking and living which negates the viable options that we have in kind of seizing the life that we have, which is the whole idea, I find, in the eternal return. It's trying to kind of affront the past and future together and kind of show us in this eternal circle, the entire moment that we're living in. So I just finished D.C. Schindler's critique of Pure Reason, and I found that Schindler did not go far enough. This is what I got from that book. He didn't go far enough in really reconciling Nietzsche's view within Neoplatonism. So how would you find? Yeah, sorry.
I'd like to challenge you on that. I think one of the arguments that Schindler is repeatedly making about the Republic is that to understand Platonism simply as the ascent is to misunderstand Platonism profoundly. It's to misunderstand the Republic. That's one of his central theses, right? That it is not only the ascent, but the return, and you need both in order to understand intelligibility, to understand reality, and to understand the proposal of Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism tried to capture this in the idea of both the procession of emanation and the return and emergence. So I think that understanding Plato as just the ascent, just the pulling away into transcendence, is to misunderstand him. Now, I happen to think that Schindler does a lot of good exegetical and hermeneutic work to show that Plato is arguing that the return, right, and Nietzsche's really doing it with the eternal return, by the way, the return is just as important as the ascent. The descent and the ascent are equally important to understanding Plato's proposal about intelligibility, the forms, reality, the relationship between appearance and the absolute, as Schindler puts it. And I think that is the proper response to Nietzsche, that he is only seeing one half of the Platonic movement. And this is the reason why Plato writes the dialogues. He doesn't make technical formal arguments. and this, of course, is consonant with all the work of third-wave Platonism. Why is Plato writing these dramatic dialogues if all he wants us to do is formally, conceptually ascend upwards? Well, because he doesn't. He wants, is what I've been arguing at the beginning, is he wants a proper integration between the two. Now, were there forms of Platonism, especially in Europe at Nietzsche's time, that were doing exactly what Nietzsche was criticizing? Totally. Is Kant in some way doing that? I think Nietzsche's right to see that. To see Kant, though, as a Platonist is a really kind of difficult thing to do, because Kant is presuming a kind of profound nominalism of the external world that Plato would deeply reject. So is Nietzsche responding to people that, are there legitimate targets? Is he just making it up? No, I think there's people who are actually subject to his critique. Is Plato subject to that critique? No, for the reasons I've given. And my second point is, I think this is also based on a very problematic reading of Socrates on the part of Nietzsche. And if you say we need a good, right, we need an existential interpretation of Socrates, that's what Nietzsche was offering. I would say to you, look at Kierkegaard's wrestling with Socrates, a much better interpretation and understanding of the existential import of Socrates, and doesn't have to be what Nietzsche says, things like at times where he wants a musical Socrates and things like that, and I think that's something breaking through that should have broken through. But presenting Socrates as some hyper rationalist in the Leibnizian sense of rationalism, I don't see that at all. I mean, that doesn't take into account the fact that Nietzsche clearly is Socrates is clearly able to stand, for 48 hours in deep mindfulness, that he has his daemonium, that he puts so much premium on love, that he admits to a kind of profound learned ignorance that transcends him out of the non-propositional. I think Nietzsche's reading of Socrates is just off. Those two things can't be separated from each other. You can't have a critique of Platonism that's based on a profound misreading of of Socrates, because one of the jobs of Platonism is to try and get the best reading of Socrates. Those are the 2 points of my criticism.
Thanks for your response, John.
Yeah, I know you probably don't agree, but I wanted to give you at least a well-developed response because you asked a good question.
So next we have a question from Alexandra, who wants to ask a question. But I just have a short info. Seeing as you're such a fan of Plato, John, one of our regulars here, Sally Jo, often will bring her young child on camera, and as young children are, we get to watch them grow up and say silly things, and I think it was me, her, Manuel, Mark, and he's showing us his Plato and showing us all the things it can do, and we have wisdom insight, and I say, aha, he's trying to demonstrate Plato's idea of the form with the Play-Doh. And we thought that was
that's good. That's very good.
But so Alexandra, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi everyone. Hi John, thank you so much again. And I want to say particularly thank you for the video you did with Paul van der Clay, where you were talking about the struggles trying to reintegrate church and monastery and university, and it really resonated with me so much with my work in psychedelic therapy, because all of those issues are just so prominent. But today,
first of all, thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. That was very powerful what you just said. I won't make you digress from your question, but yeah, I can see why that would come up in your work. Yeah, and your vulnerability in that video, I really, really value. So thank you. Like when you said,
I don't know. It's exactly what I've been crying in my mind for a year and a half now, right? But today, I want to ask about the good, the ontological good, because
Yes.
it's really, really difficult to detach from a moral concept or an aesthetic concept of the good, and then to try and kind of reconcile that with a non-dual perspective. We're doing a Nishitani book club at the moment. I'm
Oh wow!
facilitating, and
Oh
we've
wow!
come up against his discussion of evil. And I mean, is the ontological good set in a non-dual kind of fashion, or is there a polarity to it? Or, like, I struggle with that.
Okay, so a couple of questions. Notice the one good you left out. You mentioned aesthetic good, beauty, and moral goodness, righteousness, which we often call goodness, and then terribly confuse the matter. You left out truth. I ask you, is truth a good? Most people say yes, and then I ask you, what kind of good is it? And you want to say, well, it's not an aesthetic good, and it's not a moral good. It's kind of an epistemic good. And then you get things like, oh, but the true and the good, the moral good, the normative good, are somehow oh, wow, they're massively interpenetrating. So what I want to say is that the ontological good is trying to bring back the idea that these three normative domains, epistemic, the ethical, and the aesthetic, are not autonomous the way Kant argued that they were. They're actually deeply interpenetrating. You can make an argument, like I just did, by looking at their conceptual and phenomenological interdependence. I just sort of gestured towards that. You could note that when you're getting people to make normative judgments of beauty or truth or goodness, they're using the same part of the brain. Well, why don't we have distinct areas if they are so radically autonomous from each other? If they can be so functionally integrated, that means that they must be structurally integrated in a profound way. And I take this argument very seriously. What I propose is that what is in common between, if you try to look through beyond all three of them, like lenses that you've lined up, trying to see beyond them, what they all rely on is what I was trying to convey earlier. This idea that the ontological good is the promise that the depths of our intelligibility that are disclosed in our best epistemic judgments, our best ethical judgments, our best aesthetic judgments, the depths of intelligibility conform in ongoing, inexhaustible ways to the depths of reality. That reality keeps meeting us. Reality is faithful to us. As we go deeper, it can respond more deeply. And I don't just mean like the way we're doing in physics. I mean in all kinds of dimensions of depth. So I can't give you an argument for that faithfulness, why I should be faithful to it, because any argument I make presupposes that my patterns of intelligibility ultimately touch, participate in real patterns in reality. Because if that is not made, if that is not there, and this is what I take to be the Platonic argument against sort of a modern post-Kantian perspective, if I'm just locked inside my subjective experiences, sort of postcard representations of the external world, I have no way of putting them together such that I get back to the external world. I'm locked into solipsistic skepticism. Insofar,
Yeah.
yes.
And if you have a non-dual experience, and you come out of that, and it's so real, capital R, real, and
Exactly. Exactly.
and it's so uplifting, so that you are reconnected to the whole of creation afterwards, and profoundly transformed by it.
Non-duality is ultimate participatory knowing. Sorry, you broke up there for a sec. What did you say?
I just wonder if if there's a better word than good, because good seems to be so confusing.
Yeah, I mean, Dan Shappy and I, when we're talking about this, he's proposing that we go back and just use the Greek word Plato uses for that gets translated as the good. Then leave the word goodness for ethical goodness, even though that's confusing. It's a fundamental category mistake where you're using a member as the name for a category, right? So I agree with that. I think non-duality experiences are the experiences non-duality is the deepest participatory knowing. It's knowing by identity taken to its fullest. It's complete conformity. It's complete interdependence. It's your complete indwelling of the world and internalization of the world. Yes, and the fact that people regard this as the really real, I think, is our primary phenomenological evidence for the faithfulness of the good, because we find in the ultimate of our experience there's an ultimate of reality that corresponds in a way that makes the most sense, gives us the greatest sense of realness. And I think this deserves to be taken very, very seriously. Now, if you do that, and if you really take it through, then you have to ask the question you originally posed to me, which is a deep question, and maybe we should come back to it next time, but which is the problem of evil. Then you have to ask, are we meaning just moral evil, which is what most people now mean by evil? They just mean significant immorality. In which case, the problem doesn't arise, because moral goodness is of a different ontological category than ontological goodness. Right?
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay. By the way, you're satisfied in that. I'm happy. If you mean there's something like ontological evil, then you've got to give me an ontology of it, and that's a different problem or issue.
Well, not if you're coming from a non-dual perspective, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Alexandra. Before you leave, did you want to plug your book club? Can you tell us a bit about it?
Oh, okay. Well, we're meeting in the book club channel after John leaves us, and we're starting from that exact point at the end of the first essay where he's discussing the idea of evil, and we're moving into the second essay this week. So please, anyone interested, come join us.
Great. Thanks so
much.
Which
book are you reading? Are you reading Religion and Nothingness by Nishitani?
Yeah, Religion and Nothingness,
the top 5 books I've read in my entire life. Read it deeply, studied it deeply twice. For me?
Yeah, it totally has blown my mind, and this is my second time through reading it, and there's just more and more and more. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I think it's required reading ultimately. Not initially by any means, but I think it's required reading ultimately for anybody who wants to respond to the meaning crisis. Nishitani is maybe the profoundest thinker of nihilism. His critique of Nietzsche, which is similar to the one I was giving earlier, I think is quite deep and profound. That book and his earlier book, The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, I think are just, like I say, ultimate reading for awakening from the meaning crisis. In fact, I was inspired to give the word awakening to the meaning crisis because of Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry, did you want to say something else, John?
No. I just that's Nishitani's basic answer, that we have to awaken from the meaning crisis. We can't argue or answer it.
Well, thanks. I wanted to thank you, John, for your insight as always, and thank you to everyone who's watching, everyone watching on YouTube, and to all the people who asked some great questions. We really appreciate you. And again, if you're watching on YouTube and you want to participate, we do this usually on the last Monday of the month, but you'll have to join the Discord server. There'll be a link in the show notes here. So thank you again, John, for being here, and thank you, Andre, for helping me co-host today.
I thought if I could throw in a plug. So John has worked with Johannes Niederhausen in the past, and he has a course in Nishitani, and I saw John directly comment on it saying, "This is great." So I thought, if you want to check out Nishitani, go check out Johannes Niederhausen and his work. And
It's actually
he's got a
it's
course on that.
sorry for interrupting, Andre. It's under Johannes's Halcyon Academy, but the person who teaches the course is a student of Johannes's, Daniel Zaruba, and it's excellent. It's excellent. I've also, some of you have seen me in dialogue with Daniel Zaruba, or the three of us, myself and Daniel and Johannes. So you can look for it under Johannes, but you'll find the person actually teaching it and leading it is Daniel Zaruba, and I still highly recommend it.
Yeah, that's right. It's under the academy. We can provide links to that if anyone wants to check that out. Just post a comment. Thanks for coming, John. Lovely speaking to you again. And I hope you're well.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's always it's joyful, not even pleasurable. It's joyful for me to be here. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, John.